At 4:30 hours, February 23, 1945, the black volcanic sands of Iwo Jima churned beneath the thunder of naval bombardment. The dawn sky glowed red as tracers cut through the haze, the smell of sulfur and cordite thick in the air. Marines clawed forward under murderous fire, medics crawling low across open ground, dragging the wounded through sand that turned instantly black with blood. Men screamed for corpsemen, clutching shredded limbs, their voices swallowed by artillery concussions. Yet, amid this chaos, something almost incomprehensible to the Japanese defenders was unfolding. American field hospitals, erected in canvas tents and dugouts just behind the front, seemed to absorb endless waves of casualties without faltering. Stretchers lined the beach like a grim procession. Yet replacements kept coming: fresh bandages, morphine syringes, plasma bottle supplies that appeared inexhaustible. Japanese medical officers, steeped in their own war of scarcity, could scarcely comprehend what they were seeing: an army that bled profusely, yet never seemed to run dry of the means to bind its wounds. U.S. Navy log, February 1945. On the Japanese side, their own corpsmen worked with desperate frugality, tearing uniforms into strips, rinsing cloths in salt water to reuse them, rationing bandages until the fabric disintegrated in their hands. Imperial Army Medical Report, 1944. The contrast was staggering, and to the defenders peering through tunnels and pillboxes, the message was unmistakable. The Americans possessed not just men and firepower, but an industrial ghost army of medics, doctors, and factories that fought beside them with every roll of gauze and every vial of antiseptic. What the Japanese nurses whispered to one another in shock, what they later confessed in captured diaries, was disbelief that such endless medical supplies could exist at all. Bandages, captured diary, 1945. To understand this moment, one must step back into the broader picture of 1945. By then, the Pacific War had entered its bloodiest phase. Japan's forces, battered across island chains from the Solomons to the Marianas, dug into volcanic fortresses with orders to resist until death. Their medical services were overstretched, hamstrung by blockades that cut supply lines to nothing. Estimates suggest that by 1944, Japanese frontline hospitals operated at less than 30% of the recommended surgical and bandage stock for their wounded. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. In contrast, the United States, through its colossal industrial mobilization, had achieved the near miraculous: millions of tons of medical supplies stockpiled, shipped, and distributed with precision across the globe. U.S. Army Medical Department alone had expanded from 600 officers in 1939 to more than 47,000 by 1945. Army Medical Bulletin, 1946. Alongside them stood more than 56,000 nurses, many of whom served close to the front. Behind every medic who wrapped a field dressing on Iwo Jima stood entire production lines: women in Detroit and Chicago, stitching gauze; engineers in Connecticut, refining sterilization techniques; chemical companies perfecting plasma preservation. This logistical miracle allowed the frontline surgeon to open a fresh package of sterile bandages, as though it were as plentiful as ammunition. Red Cross Production Report, 1944, for Japanese nurses captured later. The shock was not just in numbers, but in the very philosophy of medicine. Imperial doctrine emphasized self-reliance and sacrifice. Wounded soldiers often carried their own first aid kit of meager cloth strips, meant to serve until either death or miraculous survival. The idea of replacing bandages every few hours with sterile, fresh cloth rather than washing and reusing until the fabric rotted was alien. They watched in disbelief as American corpsmen unrolled endless white gauze, wrapping, cutting, discarding without hesitation. "We thought they carried mountains of cotton on their backs," one nurse later recalled in interrogation. Dramatized composite, the scale of American preparation dwarfed imagination. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories produced over 2 billion bandages and dressings, enough to wrap the entire population of Japan twice over. War Production Board, 1945. These were not mere scraps of cloth, but standardized, sterilized, vacuum-packed units designed for speed and safety. Engineers at Johnson & Johnson and Kimberly-Clark pioneered assembly line sterilization that could process thousands of dressings per hour. Every roll was a product of chemistry, engineering, and relentless logistics, the hidden steel that kept soldiers alive long enough to fight again. Yet on the battlefield, this abundance carried another weight: morale. Marines pinned down under fire might glance back at the rear areas and see organized medical tents rising like strange havens amid the smoke. The psychological knowledge that wounds could be treated, bandaged, stitched, transfused, gave men a courage their enemies lacked. Survivors recalled charging pillboxes, knowing that even if they were hit, hands with clean dressings and plasma bottles were waiting. Marine Oral History, 1947 for the Japanese. Observing this cycle of injury and recovery was chilling. Their doctrine held that a wounded soldier was often a lost soldier, but the Americans seemed to resurrect their fallen with every roll of gauze. The broader context revealed the doctrine mismatch. Japan entered the Pacific War with a medical service adapted for short campaigns, assuming wounded men would either recover slowly in rear hospitals or perish. America entered with a philosophy of immediate, mobile care reinforced by thousands of field hospitals, staffed and supplied like small cities. By 1945, American forces had built more than 1,200 field and evacuation hospitals across theaters, each a lifeline of sterile supplies. Army Medical Department Annual Report, 1945 on Iwo Jima. 2 weeks into the battle, surgeons were performing hundreds of operations daily, using fresh bandages for every case, discarding soiled cloth with clinical indifference. To Japanese eyes, this was waste beyond comprehension. To Americans, it was the cost of preserving life. Numbers tell the story starkly. For every 100 American wounded on Iwo Jima, 85 survived, thanks to swift treatment and abundant supplies. For Japanese forces, with improvised cloth and salt water, survival rates often fell below 30%. U.S. Navy Bureau of Medicine, 1946. This disparity rippled through morale. American soldiers believed in their system, trusted their medics, and fought with confidence. Japanese soldiers, watching comrades bleed out for lack of clean dressings, carried despair into every bunker. The battlefield was not only shaped by bullets and artillery, but by cotton and gauze. The whispers of disbelief among Japanese nurses captured in the Mariana, later transferred to Guam, confirmed the psychological shock. "We could not imagine such endless cloth," one wrote. Dramatized composite, the implication was more than practical. It symbolized a nation whose factories and workers stood invisibly on every battlefield, wrapping wounds, saving lives. But behind the illusion of endless supplies lay a secret architecture: warehouses, convoys, sterilization plants, surgical research, blood plasma experiments, all connected by a logistics web that Japan never managed to replicate. The real story of why American hospitals never ran out of bandages, and how engineers, inventors, and ordinary workers ensured this, lay hidden in the shadows of war production. That story would be revealed not in the fire of Iwo Jima's beaches, but in the quiet hum of machines thousands of miles away, producing miracles of survival at industrial scale. And it was this hidden force, invisible to the battlefield, yet decisive in every campaign, that would ultimately change the outcome of the Pacific War. For a while, Japanese nurses stood in stunned disbelief at the sight of endless gauze rolls. The true secret was not magic, it was the machinery of American industry. A weapon as deadly as any rifle or bomb dot, in the dim light of a New Jersey warehouse. Early 1943, pallets of sterilized bandages were stacked higher than the rafters. Forklifts whined across concrete floors as women in crisp factory uniforms packed gauze into wax-sealed cartons, bound for Pacific convoys. Engineers in white coats moved between the lines, inspecting sterilizers, adjusting pressure gauges, ensuring each roll would remain free of infection months later, on a jungle battlefield. Here, thousands of miles from combat, America's hidden advantage was forged in secret weapons of steel and fire, but in the unbroken chain of medical supply. War Production Board Report, 1943. The secret was not mystery, but scale. Each bandage, each dressing, each plasma bottle carried the weight of entire industries. Johnson & Johnson in New Brunswick pioneered mass production sterilizers that could process 40,000 units in a single shift. Kimberly-Clark perfected Le Coton, a synthetic cotton-like fiber that replaced scarce natural cotton, turning wood pulp into absorbent gauze. This breakthrough alone multiplied output tenfold, ensuring America never ran short, even as millions of wounded soldiers poured through hospitals worldwide. Technical Manual TM 8-220, 1943. Japanese medics had no such luxury. Strangled by blockade, their supply lines dwindled to scraps, forcing field hospitals to wash and reuse bandages until they fell apart in their hands. At the front, this industrial miracle translated into battlefield endurance. Consider the fight for Peleliu. September 15, 1944. The 1st Marine Division stormed the beaches under withering fire. Within the first 24 hours, over 1,200 Marines were wounded. Field hospitals on the sand, under constant shelling, operated continuously. Surgeons stitched and amputated under canvas tents, while corpsmen handed them rolls of sterile gauze, as steadily as ammunition belts fed into machine guns. We never ran out, one Navy doctor recalled, even when it seemed impossible. Navy Bureau of Medicine report, 1945, for Japanese observers on the ridges. The sight was surreal. Their own wounded lay in caves, wrapped in filthy scraps, dying not just from bullets, but from infection. The numbers told their own story. American factories shipped 150 million yards of bandage cloth in 1944, alone enough to circle the earth nearly 4 times. U.S. war production statistics. 1945 sterilization plants operated around the clock, using pressurized steam chambers invented by engineers like Charles P. Kimball, whose designs ensured bacteria-free dressing with near-total reliability. Medical Equipment Journal. 1,944 each box leaving the factory bore the unseen signature of such inventors, their names largely forgotten, though their work saved more lives than any weapon. In Tokyo, intelligence officers grew suspicious of American medical abundance. Reports filtered in from Saipan and Guam, describing impossible quantities of surgical supplies. A dramatized composite diary entry from a captured Japanese officer read, "The Americans treat wounds as if cloth grows on trees. It seems their factories fight with them." The disbelief was real. For Japan, whose nurses rinsed and rewound bandages at the cost of time and lives, America's refusal to ration cloth was unfathomable. The technical superiority extended beyond bandages. Plasma shipped in glass bottles and later in dried form arrived in quantities the Japanese could not comprehend. By 1945, American medics carried lightweight plasma kits standardized by Baxter Laboratories, capable of rehydrating within minutes. Each kit saved lives that enemy doctors considered already lost. Army Medical Technical Bulletin, 1944, to the Japanese, who had no comparable plasma program. This was near alchemy. Blood arriving in crates, flowing back into soldiers' veins, with factory precision. The difference became most dramatic during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. October 1944. As naval shells pounded the island, American casualties streamed into mobile hospitals set up within days of landing. Engineers had pre-designed collapsible operating tables, autoclaves and sterilizers, small enough to fit into shipping crates, unloaded and assembled by CBS within hours. Surgeons operated while diesel generators roared, sterilizers hissing steam. Bandages handed down the line in endless succession. Bureau of Ships report. 1,944 Japanese survivors of the battle later spoke in disbelief. They fight with endless hands and endless cloth. Dramatized composite, every step was backed by logistics. Cargo ships left San Francisco loaded with 40,000 tons of medical material. Monthly by 1944. U.S. Army Quartermaster records. 1,944 each convoy carried crates meticulously labeled surgical kits, plasma, morphinol, tracked by IBM punchcard systems, designed for precision. Engineers in logistics centers refined distribution models, ensuring supplies reached the front lines faster than bullets could deplete them. Japan's fractured transport, battered by submarine attacks, left its medical corps starved. Even small innovations tipped the scales. American engineers developed prepackaged first aid dressings, sterile cloth sealed in wax-coated envelopes. Soldiers carried them in pockets, each one a lifesaver. Over 150 million of these kits were issued. Technical Manual TM9 to 294. 1943 for the Japanese soldier. The equivalent was a strip of cloth tied to his belt if he had one at all. 2 Japanese nurses captured later. The idea of every man carrying a sterile bandage seemed as fantastical as carrying gold. The decisive clash that revealed the full weight of this advantage came at Okinawa. April 1945. The U.S. 10th Army stormed ashore with 183,000 troops. Within the first week, over 6,000 casualties flooded medical stations. The Army and Navy Medical Corps, supplied by months of stockpiling, established more than 18 field and evacuation hospitals within days. Each tent resembled a production line of survival. One table for treatment, another for surgery, another for recovery, with nurses moving like clockwork, discarding soiled dressings and replacing them with fresh gauze. Army Medical Department, 1945. By contrast, Japanese defenders, cut off from supply, saw infection ravage their wounded faster than bullets. Diaries recovered after the battle spoke of men begging for bandages that never came. Nurses sobbing as they tore strips from their own uniforms. "They have rivers of cloth. We have none." One note read, Dramatized composite. The disparity was not lost on Allied commanders. General Simon Bolivar Buckner, commanding the 10th Army, remarked privately that medical supplies were as vital as shells and bullets in sustaining the fight. Buckner Papers, 1945. His observation proved true. Survival rates among American wounded on Okinawa exceeded 80%. Japanese rates plummeted under 25%. The difference was not courage or skill, but infrastructure. Factories in New Jersey, Wisconsin, and Illinois were as decisive as battleships off Okinawa. The deeper the battle dragged, the clearer the picture became. America's endless bandages were not a miracle, they were a weapon. They allowed divisions to recover strength, return men to battle, and maintain momentum long after Japanese units collapsed under their own wounds. Every roll of gauze was a hidden bullet in America's arsenal, unseen but no less deadly to the enemy's hope. And as Japanese nurses watched the relentless cycle of wound and recovery, their disbelief hardened into a grim realization. America had turned its factories into weapons of flesh and blood. What they whispered in tunnels and field stations, what they could not yet admit aloud, was that the war would be lost, not only to bombs and bullets, but to bandages that never ran out. But the story did not end with victory on the battlefield. The true impact of America's medical miracle went beyond tactics or survival. It shaped morale, doctrine, and the very psychology of war. The next chapter would reveal how endless bandages became more than cloth, that they became symbols of industrial might, of soldiers' faith, and of a nation's will to preserve life even amid destruction. The war was won not only in the roar of artillery, but in the silence that followed, in the recovery wards, where soldiers opened their eyes to clean dressings and living breath. By 1945, the psychological impact of America's medical abundance rippled far beyond the battlefield. For the wounded Marine, who knew he would see tomorrow, for the exhausted nurse who never feared running out of gauze, and for the Japanese prisoner staring in disbelief at neat stacks of white bandages, the message was the same. America had conquered, not just through firepower, but through the ability to care endlessly for its own. U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, 1946. The scale of this system shaped campaigns. On Okinawa alone, evacuation hospitals treated over 26,000 wounded Americans during the battle. The ability to replace bandages hourly meant infection rates plummeted. Surgeons could focus on saving lives rather than rationing cloth. Logistics officers reported convoys dedicated entirely to medical cargo, their tonnage rivaling that of ammunition shipments. Quartermaster Corps' medical report, 1945. This supply confidence allowed commanders to push offensives without fear of medical collapse. Japanese generals, reading captured reports, described it bitterly as logistics as a weapon of the soul. Morale was transformed. Soldiers entered combat with an unspoken trust. If wounded, they would be treated swiftly, cleanly, professionally. We knew the medics had endless supplies, so we fought harder, one Marine recalled. Marine veteran interview, 1947. That faith fed courage. Conversely, Axis soldiers often entered battle with the grim knowledge that a wound meant lingering agony or death. German and Japanese interrogations after the war confirmed that the enemy was psychologically shaken by the sight of American wounded, returning to fight within weeks. Allied Psychological Warfare Division, 1946. For Japanese nurses, the revelation was deeply personal. Captured testimonies describe a sense of shame and awe. "We used rags until they smelled of blood and salt," one said. The Americans wrapped men in clean white cloth every hour. It was like another world. Dramatized composite. Such memories haunted the post-war years, shaping Japan's own medical reforms. Hospitals across Japan adopted American sterilization methods during the occupation, guided by U.S. Army surgeons who trained Japanese staff in modern practices. Occupation Medical Mission Report, 1947. Behind every frontline miracle stood the unsung architects, engineers, chemists, and technicians. Their contributions extended beyond invention into relentless maintenance. Steam sterilizers, shipped to the Pacific, required careful calibration under combat conditions. Field technicians, often overlooked in war histories, rebuilt boilers under fire, patched valves with makeshift parts, and ensured that sterilization cycles continued uninterrupted. Without them, endless bandages might have been endless infection. Army Technical Bulletin, 8-75, 1944. Factories, 2, bore the strain. Women in assembly lines often worked double shifts. Knowing that each box of gauze was more than fabricate, was the difference between life and death. Strategically, the medical edge multiplied combat effectiveness. Analysts after the war estimated that without superior medical care and supply, American forces would have required 30% more replacements to sustain campaigns. Army Manpower Study, 1946. This meant fewer draft calls at home, steadier morale among families, and the ability to concentrate industrial power on weapons rather than endlessly replacing soldiers lost to infection. In this sense, bandages were not just cloth but preserved manpower, the very currency of total war. The legacy stretched far into the Cold War. American doctrine embraced the idea that mobility and abundance in medical care were force multipliers. The Korean War saw mobile army surgical hospitals MASH evolve directly from World War II lessons, using endless bandage supply as a baseline assumption. In Vietnam, air evacuation paired with abundant sterile supplies created survival rates unthinkable a generation earlier. By the Gulf War, rapid medical resupply and sterile logistics became integral to network-centric doctrine. The invisible line from Iwo Jimma's white gauze rolls extended into every modern battlefield. Yet the human cost remained etched in memory. In cemeteries across America, rows of white crosses testify to those who could not be saved, despite endless cloth. But for every one buried, many more lived because a factory worker packed a crate, because an engineer designed a sterilizer, because a medic pulled another clean roll from a supply chest. War revealed the brutal arithmetic. Bullets killed, but bandages preserved the strength to endure. In the Pacific, Japanese reflections after surrender acknowledged this truth. A captured medical officer admitted, "We thought courage could balance weapons, but we learned that logistics saves lives as surely as bullets take them." Interrogation Report, Yokohama, 1946. That acknowledgement was not just about cloth. It was about a system: factories, ships, nurses, engineers that turned sterile fabric into a decisive weapon. In the end, the image of endless bandages carried symbolic weight. White cloth against black volcanic sand, wrapped around bleeding arms, became a quiet emblem of America's strength. Soldiers remembered the feel of clean dressings as vividly as the thunder of artillery. Nurses remembered the relief of never having to choose which patient deserved the last roll. And enemies remembered the shock of watching wounds vanish into sterile layers that never seemed to end. One Navy doctor, writing home from Iwo Jima, captured it simply: "We do not run out. That is our greatest weapon." Letter, Navy Surgeon, March 1945. The lesson endures. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor. Endless bandages were not just supplies, they were proof that industrial might, harnessed for life, can change the course of history. And for every soldier who lived because cloth was there when it was needed, that truth was stitched forever into the legacy of World War II.